Hello, welcome to our subject, Afro-Asian Literature. So in this video, I will share to you the first topic we have, and that is the brief history and background of African and Asian literature. We will have two parts of this video, and part one would be for the African literature, its history and background, and the second part would be for the Asian literature, its history and its background. To introduce, Afro-Asian literature mirrors not only the customs and tradition of African and Asian countries, but also their philosophy of life, which on the whole are deeply and predominantly contemplative and huntingly sweet. Afro-Asian literature is the reflection of the storm and the stress of developing nations seeking a place under the sun, which every student must understand, so one may know how this literature is defined through the history and culture of a nation. In a simpler thought, Afro-Asian literature refers to the literary output of the various countries and culture in Africa and Asia. This includes their oral tradition from the earliest to the contemporary written and or published prose and poetry. So let's start our first topic. We will be learning the brief background and history of African literature. The earliest known recorded history of Africa arose in ancient Egypt and later in Nubia, the Sahel, the Maghreb or the Northwest Africa, and the Horn of Africa or the Somali Peninsula. Africa as the second largest continent on earth is widely recognized as the birthplace of humankind. The peoples of Africa probably speak more languages than those of any other continent. It is generally said that billions of years ago, the first upright humans appeared in Africa, and they learned how to hunt, create tools, and make fire. So from Africa, they spread to Europe and other parts of Asia. The continent has undergone so many changes due to its climate. The Sahara Desert was actually a fertile area suitable for farming, but it grew drier and became a desert. Interestingly, Africans coped with whatever challenge the climate would give them, and they survived. Writing was said to have been invented in Northeast Africa during the Bronze Age, specifically in Egypt. So the Egyptians, because of their rich cultures or resources, were able to make tools and weapons out of bronze. However, climate change overtook the continent once again and changed their landscape. The deserts began to occupy a wider area, and Africa was increasingly cut off from the outside world. These deserts also hampered transportation via the sea. The Arabs spread Islam to Africa. During the Middle Ages, the Arabs came to Egypt and conquered them, which happened fast, and they were soon in charge of all north of Africa. There are 15 nations which make up Africa. Each of these separate countries have their own history, culture, tribes, and traditions. That being said, there are some commonalities shared by literature which comes from the continent as a whole. Defining African literature can be complicated. There are some authors who believe African literature can only be composed in African languages, but others believe that this can be composed in any languages, so as long as it is composed by authors from Africa. So in this lesson, we will narrow our focus to the broader history and characteristics of African literature in general. Now, before we proceed to the history of African literature, let me share to you some great people in Africa. We have one, Nelson Mandela. Do you know who Nelson Mandela is? He is actually the first ever Black African who was elected as the President of South Africa. He is known as the father of the nation or the father of South Africans because he fought for independence and eventually became the first president. He's also a writer. He's a peace advocate. We also have Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu, who was a fierce opponent of the apartheid in Africa, was the first Black African bishop of Cape Town, and because of his exhaustive efforts to promote peace, he has won several awards, which include the Nobel Peace Prize and the Gandhi Peace Prize. Then we have Charlize Theron. Charlize Theron is a South African actress who has acted in many blockbuster films in Hollywood and has won countless of awards for her talent. She is known as the first South African to win an Academy Award or an Oscar. She was born in Africa, and she was noted for her versatility and earned many awards for Best Actress for her performance as a real-life serial killer in Monster, and that was the Academy Award. So let us now proceed. So African literature has origins dating back thousands of years to ancient Egypt. One of the well-known or the most famous kind of writing they have is through the hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs, these are writings which uses pictures to represent words. So also, when Egyptians began using burial texts to accompany their dead, they used the hieroglyphs. These also include the first written account of creation, which is the Memphite Declaration of Deities, or the Memphite theology that is in their own term of their sacred scripture. So the Memphite theology talks about the humans are created through the power of the Creator's heart and speech. Not only that, but they also have the papyrus. Papyrus is the um, first type of paper, or from which we originate our word for paper. So it was invented by Egyptians and writing flourished during this time. So this is the beginning of the time when writing or literary texts were already published, but in a manual form. So these are the ancient Egyptian writings, that is through pictures or through symbols, that led to Arabic poetry as well, which spread during the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century and through Western Africa in the 9th century CE. So these African and Arabic cultures continued to blend with our European culture and literature to form a unique literary form. This consists of a body of work in different languages and various genres, ranging from oral literature to written literature in colonial languages, which are in French, Portuguese, and the English. Going back to the history of Africa, they experienced several hardships in its long history, which left an impact on the themes of its literature. One hardship which led to many others is that of colonization. When we talk about colonization, it is when people leave their country and settle in another land, often one which is already inhabited. The problem with colonization is when the incoming people exploit the indigenous people and the resources of the inhabited land. So these are some of the results or effects of colonization to Africa. Africa's economy is still recovering from the effects of colonialism through loss of resources, disruption of its political systems, cultural and ethnic oppression of its people, and European colonizers left very little money to develop roads, railroads, airports, or productive education system for the people of those countries. So colonization then led to slavery. Like millions of African people were enslaved and brought to Western countries around the world from the 16th to 19th centuries. This spreading of African people, which is largely against their will, is called the African Diaspora. So the African Diaspora is the mass dispersion of people from Africa during the transatlantic slave trades from 1500s to the 1800s. So this development of activities came as a result of missionaries coming to the area. The missionaries came to Africa to build churches, teach language in schools in order to translate religious texts, which led to African writing in both European and indigenous languages. So the Sub-Saharan, or commonly called the Black Africa, is geographically the area of continent of Africa that lies south of the Sahara. So the Sub-Saharan Africa developed a written literature during the 19th and early 20th century. And these are the traditional oral poetry and written literature. In this video, I'll also be sharing to you the different types of literature and its history in Africa, which are their oral literature, their written literature, the colonial or colonial, the pre-colonial and the colonial literature, and the post-colonial literature. So most of the popular works have come out since 1950, especially the noteworthy Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Looking beyond the most recent works is necessary to understand the complete development of this collection of literature. So the Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe depicts the pre-colonial life in the southeastern part of Nigeria and the invasion by Europeans during the late 19th century. So the first is the oral literature, the history of the oral literature. Africa has long and complex literary history. We know that already in the previous slides. Indeed, to suggest that when one historical account can represent all of the literature across time from all of the regions of Africa, which is quite misleading. But deciding when African literature first appears or when the tradition begins are questions that are ultimately unanswerable in determining which literary forms originate in Africa or which are borrowed from elsewhere, are issues over which literary critics continue to debate. Nevertheless, scholars of African literature have put forth a general historical overview that allows readers, listeners, and students to gain a sense of literary history of Africa. The first part of the history is its oral literature. So oral literature has flourished in Africa for many centuries, and it takes a variety of forms including folk tales, myths, epics, funeral dirges, praise poems, and proverbs. So myths, according to Oyekan Owomoyela, usually explains the interrelationships of all things that exist. This provides the group and its members a necessary sense of their place in relation to their environment and the forces that order events on Earth. Some examples under myth, tales, and epics are the example of Mwindo epic and the epic of Sundiata. We know that epic elaborate literary forms usually performed only by experts on special occasions, and this genre or this type of literary text or literature or literary piece talks about the heroes and their supernatural powers. So the Mwendo epic is the oral tale from the Congo about a child with magical powers who is Mwendo. He is the son of the chief Tangoniropa who escapes his father's murderous wrath to return later and overcome the tyrant. The epic of Sundiata, on the other hand, is the struggle of the Sundiata Kieta to save his people and found a formidable Malinke empire as the subject of it became the subject of the epic of Sundiata. So we also have other literary pieces under oral literature, and these are the dirges. These are chanted during funeral ceremonies and lament the departed, and the praises under dirges are all about the memory of the dead and his protection, his or to ask for his or her protection. We also have the praise poems, which are epithets called out in reference to an object, either a person, a town, or an animal, or a disease, and others, in celebration of its outstanding qualities and achievements. So praise poems have a variety of applications and functions. Professional groups often create poems exclusive to them, and prominent chiefs might appoint a professional performer to compile their praise poems and perform them on special occasions. In African oral tradition, storytelling as its nature is the art to mask the past, making it mysterious and seemingly inaccessible. The storyteller speaks, the time collapses, and the members of the audience are in the presence of history. So the storyteller combines the audience present waking state and its past condition of semi-consciousness, and so the audience walk again in history, joining its storytelling. Another well-known oral form of African literature is the proverb. The proverb is often employed as a rhetorical device, presenting its speaker as the holder of cultural knowledge or authority. Yet, as much as the proverb looks back to an African culture as its origin and source of authority, it creates that African culture each time it is spoken and used to make sense of immediate problems and occasions. So, proverb is a short, witty, or ironic statement, metaphorical in its formulation, that aims to communicate a response to a particular situation, to offer advice, or to be persuasive. So one example is the eye never forgets what the heart has said. So I know that you have also some proverbs which you know in your life and has become your principle in life. Now we proceed to the transition from oral tradition to written word. So oral and written storytelling traditions have had a parallel development, and in many ways they have influenced each other. Now, ancient Egyptian scribes, or the early Hausa and Swahili copyists and memorizers, and contemporary writers of popular novellas have been the obvious and crucial transitional figures in the movement from oral to literary traditions. Now, the linkage between oral tradition and the written word is most obviously seen in pulp literature. This is such as the Onitsha market literature of the Nigeria, the popular fiction of Accra, Ghana, the popular love and detective literature of Nairobi, the visualizing story in the complex comic strips sold in shops in Cape Town. So what are popular literature, or what is popular pulp literature? Pulp literature are inexpensive magazines or fictions made of cheap wood pulp paper. So right now, we have the printing press already. Our literary pieces are printed through sleeks and glosses paper. But in the past, or in their time, they use pulp literature, which is made from cheap wood pulp paper. Let us proceed now to the written literature. So many works identified by teachers and researchers in North America and Europe as African literature. So these are, although written in different languages, but writers are actually from Africa. So scholars have identified three waves of literacy in Africa. First is it occurred in Ethiopia, where written works have been discovered that appeared before the earliest literature in the Celtic and Germanic languages of Western Europe. Second, the wave of literary moved across Africa with the spread of Islam. So Islam has become the dominant religion and the first ever religion they introduced in the continent of Africa due to the Arab colonization. Then soon after the emergence of Islam in the 7th century, its believers established themselves in North Africa through a series of jihads or holy wars. So in the 11th and 12th century, Islam was carried into the kingdom of Ghana. Then the religion continued to move eastward through the 19th century. The African written literature is a combination of the real and the fantasy. So this is generally the characteristics of the African written literature. So this is the alchemy of the literary experience, which is it is defined as atomized or described as atomized or fragmented. It fragments history. So the transformation is the crucial activity of the story and its dynamic movement. The writer is examining the relationship of the reader with the world and with history. So in the process of this examination, the writer invents characters and events that correspond to the history but are not really the whole of its history. So at the center of the story is either a myth, the fantasy element, a character or event that moves beyond reality, though it is always rooted in the real thing. And in the oral tale, this is clearly the fantasy character. So it is in a complex, refracted way in written literature. So it also combines the contemporary world and the realistic world of the past, and on the other, myth and the hero, with metaphor being the agent of transformation. So you are already aware that myth, which is deeply, intensively emotional, has to do with the gods and creation, with the essence of a belief system. And for history, the story of a people, their institutions, and their community is the way one likes to think things happen in the real world. So the image of Africa then is that rich combination of myth and history. African written literature, I mean, is that a rich combination of myth and history with a hero embodying the essence of the history or battling it or somehow having a relationship with it is by the means of fantasy and a mythic character in combination with the real thing or the real experiences. Now, themes in the literary traditions of contemporary Africa are worked out frequently within the structures laid down through the imported religions of Christianity and Islam. So these are some of the influence of oral traditions in modern writers. One is through the religion of Christianity and Islam. And then another is the struggle between traditional and modern, between rural and newly urban, and between genders and between generation. So what is the characteristics or what are the characteristics of African literature? Let's take a look at some of these characteristics. And literature from Africa has many characteristics. We will just highlight some. And these are the slave narratives, protests against colonization, calls for independence, African pride, hope for the future, and the descent. Of course, this based on their history and their experiences of colonization. So this literature has been composed in English for Western and African audiences. It is also composed in African languages for African readers. But this comes from all parts of Africa, both in Northern Africa and the Sub-Saharan Africa. The themes. So oral histories, myths, and proverbs additionally serve to remind the whole communities of their ancestors' heroic deeds. The past and the precedence of their customs and traditions are the common themes of African literary works. So this is frequently used or shared to educate and entertain children. So commonly on their experiences in their colonialism, tradition, their liberation, nationalism, and even displacement and rootlessness. So the oral literature is by definition dependent on a performer who formulates it in words on a specific occasion. So coming from the oral literature, sometimes it is performed, then down to the written literature, it is actually explained in detail. Who is the father of African literature? So, the father of African literature is none other than Chinua Achebe, who is the writer of The Things Fall Apart. Later on, I'll be introducing to you, you will be analyzing the text or the literary piece, Things Fall Apart. So Chinua Achebe is the Nigerian novelist seen by millions as the father of African literature, and he died at the age of 82. He acclaimed for his unsentimental depiction of the social and psychological disorientation accompanying the imposition of Western customs and the values upon traditional African society. So his particular concern was with the emergent Africa at its moments of crisis. And his novels range in a subject matter from first contact of an African village with a white man to the educated African's attempt to create a firm moral order out of the changing values in large cities. So that's actually the synopsis or introduction of Things Fall Apart. We will know more of it later on. Now, there are different literature in African languages. So as I have mentioned a while ago, parts of the African literature is the pre-colonial literature. So first is we have the Ethiopian literature, which are composed in several languages. We have the Ge'ez, which is the classical and the literary language, and we have the Amharic, which is more common on spoken language. So most of the literature in Ethiopia has been in this has used these two languages. Second, other languages are Tigrinya, Tigre, Oromo, and Harari. So one of the write-ups under Ethiopian literature in its African language is the Kebra Nagas, or the Glory of Kings, which is written in Gi's language from 1314 to 1322. So it relates to the birth of Menelik, the son of Solomon, and Makada, the queen of Sheba, who became the king of Ethiopia. So I don't know, or I know some of you, or I don't know if some of you are familiar with the story of Sheba, who became the king of Ethiopia. Okay. Next is in the 15th century, Ta'amra Maryam, another write-up, or the Miracles of Mary, was written, and this was to become a major work in Ethiopia. At the end of the 19th century, the missionaries brought the printing press to Ethiopia. So this has began the printing of books and were published in Amharic language. So the early Amharic works such as Mystery Selassie or the Mystery of the Trinity were rooted in traditional literary works. Another, in 1924 and 1925, newspapers in Amharic began to appear, and there were translations of European literary works, including an Amharic translation of John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. We will also be analyzing or reading the text The Pilgrim's Progress in our next discussions. And then that is of course by Gabra Georges Terfe. Then, two writers created the foundation for the Amharic literary tradition. We have the Lib Whale Tariq, that is by Afarwar Gabra Iyasus. So the Lib Whale Tariq is the oral storytelling tradition is clearly evidenced in this novel, in which a girl disguised as a boy becomes the center of complex love involvements, and the climax of which includes the conversion of a love-smitten king to Christianity. We also have Heroy Walda Selassie, or the Hadith, who has written Hadith Alim, or the New World. This writer, or Heroy Walda Selassie, or Walda Selassie, is an Ethiopian foreigner minister who became the country's first major writer. So he wrote two novels that are critical of child's marriage and that extol Christianity and Western technology. So his novel Hadith Alim, or the New World, was about a youth who is educated in Europe and who, when he returns to Ethiopia, experiences clashes between his European education and the traditions of his past. Next is the drama and poetry in Ethiopian literature. So drama was also developed at this time. Playwrights included Takle Hawaryat, Takle Maryam, who wrote a comedy in 1911. So we have Yuftahe Neguse and Mengistu Lema, who wrote plays that satirize the conflict between tradition and the West. And we have Gabra Egsi Abeher, who frequently took an acerbic view of traditional life and attitudes in poetry. When we say acerbic class, this means ironic or sarcastic. So Gabra Egsi Abeher frequently took an ironic view of traditional life and attitudes in his poetry. Okay, we also have literature after the World War II under the Ethiopian African languages. So the theme of the African literature after the World War II is the relationship between humans and gods, the difficulties of life, and the importance of humility and acceptance. So important writers or significant writers continued to compose works in Amharic language during this time. So one of Ethiopia's most popular novels is written by Jermachu Tekle Hawaryat. I've already mentioned him a while ago. So who wrote the novel Araya? So Araya is about the journeying of the peasant Araya to Europe to be educated, and his struggle to decide whether to remain there or return to Africa. So it explores generational conflicts as well as the conflict between tradition and modernism. Another writer is or write-up is Kabada Michael. So Kabada Michael, he's a writer and he wrote drama reinforcing Christian values, attacking materialism and exploiting historical events. So he became a significant playwright, biographer, and historian. And then we also have writer Patrice Lumumba. He is one of the novelists who looked further afield and wrote about apartheid in South Africa and the African nationalist leader. If you talk about apartheid class, this talks on racial discrimination, conflicts, and indifferences between African and the other people or the colonizers. So other writers dealt with this conflict between old and the new, or the issue with social justice or political problems. So that's more on apartheid. Next country or next African language is in Hausa. So at the beginning of the 19th century, the Hausa language was written in Arabic script called Ajami. So the first novels written in Hausa were the result of competition launched in 1933 by the Translation Bureau in Northern Nigeria. So the Translation Bureau of Northern Nigeria is the first organization that acknowledges writers and authors of literature or literary pieces. So the Mohamado Bellos. Mohamado is another writer in Hausa language who wrote Gandoki, or it's the struggles against the British colonial regime. And then we also have Usman Danfodio, who wrote Wallahi Wallahi, a war song. So the meaning of Wallahi Wallahi class is by God, by God. Then it deals with the clash between religion and contemporary political reality. Then we also have Ihaji Umaru. His poem about social problem, Wakar Talausi, the Wadata, or the Song of Poverty and Wealth, and of Wealth. So he wrote that song. Bello, or we have, what is this? Muhammadu Bello class, his experimentation on writing literary pieces about struggles against the British and colonial regime would also find its most successful expression in Amados Tutola's English language novel, The Palm Wine Drink Card. So I will not be discussing further this English language novel writer, si Tutola. Okay, so let us proceed to the next. Now, more famous writers who use Hausa or who are in Hausa African language are Rupert East and J. Tafida Sasa, who wrote Jiki Magayi. So the Jiki Magayi is a novel of love, and it moves from realism to fantasy. Its translation is "You will pay for the injustice you caused." So it's a translation. It's also a Translation Bureau Prize winner. Then we have Jabiro Abdullahi. He wrote Nagari Nakowa, or Good to Everyone. It is a story of Salihi who comes to represent traditional Islamic virtues in a world in which such virtues are endangered. Then we have the last African language, Swahili. By the way, there are more African languages class that are used in the history of African literature, but I just highlighted 3 because these have contributions on more literary pieces in Africa. So Swahili literature is usually divided into classical and contemporary periods in genre. So both Tarekye Yapate as one piece, or the Pei Chronicle, reassembled by the 19th century scholar Fumu Omar Al-Nabani. So he is the writer. And Kabari Zalamu, or the Lamu Chronicle, takes the 18th and 19th centuries as its subject. So these are some of the write-ups with the use of Swahili African language. So other famous authors, we also have Shaaban Robert. So Shaaban Robert was the most dynamic and long-lasting effect of contemporary Swahili literature. So he wrote poetry, prose, and proverbs such as Almazi za Africa, or the African Diamonds. So in Swahili's African language class, both religious and secular poetry shows influence of Muslim Arabic literature and of the East African culture from which it arose, and it has become the central vehicle of written literary expression in Africa. So aside from those three, we also have other African languages that has poetry, drama, and stories or novels which authors shared in general. So we have Shona, Somali, Yoruba, Xhosa, Zulu, Southern Soto. But I will not be sharing some literary pieces anymore under these languages. So those are the only three that I highlighted. Now, for the colonial African literatures, because that's the pre-colonial African literature, no, in the using those languages. For the colonial or in the colonial period, Africans exposed to Western languages began to write in those tongues. So in 1911, Joseph Ephraim Casley Hayford, or also known as Ekra Agiman of the Gold Coast, or now what we call Ghana, published the first African novel written in English. So this is the Ethiopia Unbound, or the studies in race emancipation. So the African works best known in the West from the periods of colonization and the slave trade are primarily slave narratives, such as Olaudah Okinazos, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Okiano. So it's about biography. It's actually the biography of Olaudah Ekiano. Okay, and then we have that Joseph Ephraim Casley Hayford. We also have African plays written in English. So after 900 or 1900, during this period, African plays are written in English, such as Herbert Isaac Ernest Dulomo of South Africa, who published the first English language African play. This African play is The Girl Who Killed to Save, Nong Kause the Liberator, that is in the year 1935. We also have The Black Hermit by Ngugi wa Thiong'o of Kenya. This piece is a cautionary tale about tribalism or the discrimination between African tribes. It's actually the first East African drama. Then we have the African poetry during the colonial African literature. So the Anthologie de la Nouvelle Poésie Negre et Malgache de Langue Francaise, or the Anthology of the New Black and Malagasy Poetry in French language by Leopold Sédar Senghor. If you talk about anthology class, this talks about published literary piece. So this is obviously, the word anthology means published collection of piece. So it is published then in 1948 as the first anthology of French language poetry written by Africans. So let us proceed to the post-colonial African literature. So with liberation and increased literacy, since most African nations gained their independence in 1950s and in 1960s, the African literature has grown dramatically in quantity and in recognition. So with numerous African works appearing in Western academic curricula and on best of lists compiled or since the end of the 20th century. So here are some of the characteristics of post-colonial African literature. So the African writers in this period wrote both in Western languages, notably English, French, and Portuguese, and in traditional African languages, such as Hausa. So we have 7 themes under this era, the post-colonial African literature and its characteristics. So Ali Mazrui and other writers mentioned 7 themes. So this is the clash, or these are the clash between Africa's past and present. We also have between tradition and modernity. We also have between indigenous and foreign, because this leads now towards contemporary literature. Then between individualism and community, so between socialism and capitalism, between development and self-reliance, and between Africanity and humanity. So these are the themes under the post-colonial African literature. Who are the other famous authors in Africa? So this is now on the contemporary literature. So some other famous authors in Africa, we have one, Nadine Gordimer. Nadine Gordimer is a South African writer and a political activist who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1991. So he writes about moral issues in South Africa, particularly about the apartheid. And her famous works are Burger's Daughter, July's People, and Loot. So she has actually given months of her life up to serving humanity and other charitable causes. Her piece, Burger's Daughter and July's People, were banned sometime in Africa because of her participation in the activists' activity. Political activists. And then her story, Loot, the last piece that is mentioned there, is it reads like an essay, but actually it narrates a great event that starts changes within the world, and it ultimately leads to where human beings are now. So it traces the history and experiences of people of Africa. Another one is the Akin. So this one, he is actually one of the most famous author also in Africa. So he is Akin Olowole, or Wole Babatunde Soyinka. He is better known as Wole Soyinka. So he is a Nigerian poet and a playwright. He studied in both Nigeria and in UK, and later worked with the Royal Court Theatre of London. So his plays were produced both in Nigeria and London. He is also a political activist, which led to his arrest during the Nigerian Civil War and solitary confinement for 2 years. That is why he has written one of his pieces, Civilian Soldiers. Okay, so he is the first African to be honored the Nobel Peace Prize Literature in 1986. Also a political activist, and then that very well-known poem of him, The Civilian Soldiers. So other contemporary African writers that you should know, we have one, Chinua Achebe has continued writing pieces in African languages, one of the world's most widely recognized and praised writers. He wrote some of the most extraordinary works of the 20th century. So we would be learning, or we would be reading later on, that Things Fall Apart. I would try to look for a copy for that, and then let's try to know what the story is all about. And then we have other authors which will be mentioned later on in the next topic that we have, knowing our African writers. We have Ayi Kwe Arma, Aminata Forna, Nadine Gordimer. Nadine Gordimer is one of our contemporary African writers also. And then Alain Mabanko, and then Ben Okri. So I think that would be all for the history of African literature. For the next part of this video, we will be learning on the Asian history, or the history of Asian literature. So we take note that Asian has different groups. We have South Asian, and Middle East Asia, and then it covers different countries. It has a lot of countries and known authors as well in these different countries. So thank you everyone for watching. That will be all for our part 1 for the brief background and history of African and Asian literature. Bye!